The frost-covered steel groaned under Sergeant Michael Hendricks' gloved hand. It was January 8th, 1945, and the Ardennes forest stretched before him like a frozen cathedral, its snow-laden branches bending under the weight of winter and war. Inside the turret of his M4A3 Sherman, the air hung thick with the smell of gun oil, cordite residue, and the metallic tang of cold metal. The 70-60mm gun barrel pointed northeast toward the German lines, its bore cleaned and ready, though Hendricks knew the standard ammunition stacked in the wet stowage racks beneath the turret floor would be nearly useless against what they were about to face. The Battle of the Bulge had entered its fourth week. What Hitler had intended as a decisive counteroffensive to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp had devolved into a grinding war of attrition in the snow-choked valleys of Belgium. But the Germans were not retreating quietly. They were trading space for time, using their remaining Panther and Tiger tanks as mobile fortresses to cover the withdrawal of what remained of the 5th and 6th Panzer armies, and somewhere in the woods ahead, Hendricks's platoon from the 2nd Armored Division would have to face them. But today was different. Today, Corporal Jimmy Reardon, the loader, was handling ammunition that most Sherman crews had never seen. 5 rounds, just 5. Each one stamped with markings that designated them as M93 high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. The tungsten cord projectiles that tankers had been promised since August, but had arrived in quantities so small that most units never received any at all. The rounds looked deceptively similar to standard armor-piercing shells, but their weight told a different story. At just over 14 pounds compared to the standard round's 15.5, the difference came from the lightweight aluminum body surrounding a dense tungsten carbide core. The physics were elegant in their lethality. Where standard ammunition relied on mass and velocity to punch through armor, the HVAP round achieved penetration through density alone. The tungsten penetrator, traveling at over 3,400 feet per second, carried enough kinetic energy to defeat armor plates that had made Panthers and Tigers nearly invulnerable to frontal assault. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 5 rounds. That was all 2nd Battalion had received when the supply convoy finally caught up with them on January 6th. 5 rounds per 76mm gun tank, distributed on a priority basis to crews who had proven themselves in combat. 5 chances to do what had been impossible 3 months earlier when the Sherman first went up against German heavy armor in Normandy. 5 opportunities to turn the tables on an enemy who had learned to treat American tanks with something approaching contempt. Hendricks had joined the 2nd Armored Division in September of 1944, just after the division had been pulled back to refit following the breakout from Normandy. He had missed the savage fighting at Ardennes, where Sherman tanks had destroyed over 80 German Panzers through superior tactics and crew training, despite being outgunned. He had missed the early optimism when tankers first believed the 76mm gun would solve their firepower problems. But he had been there in November when that optimism died at Pufendorf, during what veterans of the division called the biggest tank battle in 2nd Armored experience. He had been there when the standard M62 armor-piercing rounds bounced off Panther glacis plates at ranges where the German tanks could fire back with devastating effect. He had learned the hard truth that American tank doctrine tried to obscure with euphemisms about maneuverability and combined arms operations. In a straight fight, tank against tank, the Sherman was outmatched. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A Panther's frontal armor, sloped at 55 degrees and measuring 80 millimeters thick on the glacis, was effectively impervious to the M62 round at any combat range. The Sherman's own armor, 64 millimeters at the thickest point, might as well have been tissue paper against the Panther's 75mm K2K 42 gun, which could penetrate over 130 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. The exchange ratio was equally stark. For every Panther destroyed, American armored divisions were losing 3 to 4 Shermans, and those were optimistic figures that assumed air support, artillery, and favorable terrain. In the close terrain of the Ardennes, where visibility was measured in dozens of yards and German positions were concealed by forest and snow, the odds were even worse. Hendricks had learned to fight the way all Sherman tank commanders learned to fight against heavy German armor. You didn't engage frontally unless you had no choice. You used his speed and maneuverability to get around to the flank or rear where armor was thinner and your gun could actually penetrate. You coordinated with other tanks in your platoon, using one section to draw fire while another maneuvered for a killing shot. You called in artillery and air support whenever possible because indirect fire didn't care about armor thickness. And you accepted that in this kind of war, casualties were not an aberration, but a tactical necessity. The doctrine even had a name for it. Though tankers never used the term where officers could hear, they called it the 5-to-1 rule. It took 5 Shermans to reliably kill 1 Panther, which meant 4 crews were going to burn so that the 5th could get the shot that mattered. But tungsten changed the equation. The M93 HVAP round could penetrate 178 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters when fired at 0 degrees of obliquity, even against the Panther's sloped glacis, where the effective thickness increased dramatically. The HVAP could achieve penetration at ranges under 300 yards. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even ideal. But it was enough to turn a hopeless engagement into one where American crews had a fighting chance. The problem was supply. Tungsten was a strategic material, essential not just for armor-piercing ammunition, but for machine tools, cutting implements, and industrial applications that kept the American war machine running. There simply wasn't enough to go around. By March of 1945, only 18,000 HVAP rounds had reached Europe, and 42% of those were fitted for the 3-inch gun used by M10 tank destroyers, not the 76mm gun mounted in Shermans. The remainder were distributed based on priorities that made sense to staff officers in the rear, but seemed almost vindictive to tankers at the front. Tank destroyer battalions got first priority. Separate tank battalions attached to infantry divisions got second priority. Armored division tank battalions, the units most likely to face German armor in sustained combat, were last on the list. So, when Hendricks's crew received their 5 rounds on the evening of January 6th, they treated the ammunition with something approaching reverence. Reardon had stenciled each round with chalk markings indicating its position in the loading sequence. The first HVAP round would be loaded after the initial ranging shot with standard armor piercing. The logic was sound. Use the cheaper, more plentiful ammunition to establish range and trajectory, then switch to the tungsten round when you knew the shot would count. The remaining 4 HVAP rounds were spaced throughout the ammunition rack, positioned so Reardon could load them quickly if the tactical situation demanded rapid fire against multiple targets. On the morning of January 8th, that tactical situation materialized in the form of radio traffic that crackled through the company net at 0545 Sitzel. German armor was moving south from the village of Houffalize, retreating along secondary roads that would take them back across the Our River and into Germany proper. The routes were predictable, dictated by terrain that funneled mechanized movement into narrow corridors where bridges still stood and roads were firm enough to support the weight of 45-ton Panzers. 2nd Armored Division had been tasked with interdicting that retreat, cutting off German escape routes and destroying as much enemy armor as possible before the Panzer divisions could establish new defensive positions east of the Siegfried Line. Combat Command A, under Colonel Bruce Clark, had positioned 3 tank platoons along likely German withdrawal routes, with supporting infantry and artillery positioned to exploit any breakthrough. Hendricks's platoon, 5 Shermans, from Baker Company of the 66th Armored Regiment, had drawn what the briefing officer called a soft assignment. They were to establish an observation post overlooking a crossroads 3 kilometers south of Houffalize, where a stone bridge crossed a frozen stream. Intelligence suggested German forces would avoid the position, preferring main roads where traffic control and engineer support could keep heavy vehicles moving. But Clark was a careful commander who had learned not to trust intelligence reports that used words like suggest and likely. He wanted eyes on that crossroads, And if German armor did appear, he wanted it destroyed before it could report back to higher headquarters that American forces had cut the southern escape routes. The platoon had moved into position under cover of darkness, using a woodcutter's trail that brought them to a low ridge overlooking the crossroads from the northwest. The position was good, but not perfect. The ridge provided defilade, allowing the Shermans to hull down with only their turrets exposed. The fields of fire were clear for approximately 800 meters, limited by a tree line to the east and the gradual rise of terrain to the south. But the stone bridge was oriented almost directly toward their position, which meant German tanks crossing from north to south would be presenting their frontally armor, exactly the scenario where the Sherman was most disadvantaged. Unless you had tungsten. Hendricks positioned his tank on the right flank of the platoon line, where the angle of fire would give him a slightly better shot at the side armor of any vehicle crossing the bridge. To his left, Lieutenant Morrison's tank occupied the center position. Its turret traversed to cover the approach from Houffalize. The other three Shermans were echeloned back, providing depth and covering alternate routes that German forces might use if they detected the ambush. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, cold enough that the tank's auxiliary power unit struggled to maintain battery charge. Hendricks had kept the main engine running at idle since 0300, wasting precious gasoline, but ensuring the tank would be ready to move if contact was made. Inside the turret, the crew wore every piece of cold weather gear the Army had issued, but the chill still crept through the steel hull and settled into bones and joints with the persistence of trench foot. Private Martinez, the driver, had fallen asleep in his seat despite explicit orders to maintain vigilance. Hendricks didn't wake him. There would be time enough for alertness when the Germans arrived, if they arrived at all. The sun rose at 0728, though sunrise in the Ardennes in January was a relative term. The sky lightened from black to grey, revealing a landscape that looked more like a charcoal sketch than a photograph. The snow was trampled and dirty where American vehicles had passed, pristine and reflective where it remained undisturbed. The stone bridge stood out against the white fields like a scar, its medieval stonework darkened by centuries of weather and the recent passage of tracked vehicles that had left deep gouges in its surface. At 0815, Morrison's voice broke squelch on the platoon net. Movement northeast, 3 vehicles. Looks like half-tracks. Hendricks traversed his turret right, bringing his optics to bear on the Houffalize road. Through the periscope, he could make out the silhouettes Morrison had spotted. 3 vehicles moving in column with the cautious pace of a unit, expecting contact. The range was approximately 1,200 meters, too far for effective engagement with main gun ammunition, but close enough to identify the vehicle types. 2 were SDKFC 251 half-tracks, the workhorses of German mechanized infantry. The third was harder to classify at this distance, possibly a command vehicle or a light armored car. "Hold fire," Morrison transmitted. "Let them pass unless they spot us. We're hunting bigger game." The half-tracks continued south, their commanders apparently unaware that 5 American tanks were watching from the ridge. They crossed the bridge without slowing, their tracks leaving fresh impressions in the snow that marked the route for whoever followed. Hendricks felt his pulse settle back to something approaching normal. The presence of reconnaissance elements suggested German forces were probing routes before committing heavy armor, which meant Panthers or Tigers might be only minutes behind. The wait stretched from minutes to hours. By 0900, the temperature had climbed to 23 degrees, warm enough that the engine could be shut down to conserve fuel. By 0930, Hendricks had worked through his emergency rations, 3 pieces of hard candy that tasted like chalk and optimism. By 0100, he was beginning to suspect that intelligence had been wrong again, that the German armor was using different routes, that his platoon would spend another day freezing in position while the war happened somewhere else. Then Martinez, suddenly and completely awake, spoke 2 words that changed everything. Panzers. Bridge. Hendricks snapped his periscope left, heart hammering as his eyes found what Martinez had seen. Emerging from the tree line north of the bridge, moving in single file with the methodical caution of experienced tankers, were German tanks, not the older Panzer C4s that Sherman crews had learned to handle with something approaching confidence. These were Panthers, the Panzer Kampfwagen, VAUSG models that had become the backbone of German armored formations since their introduction at Kursk. He counted them as they cleared the trees. 1, 2, 3, 4, a full platoon, probably the lead element of a company that was using this route to avoid Allied air interdiction and artillery concentration on the main roads. The range to the bridge was 730 meters, according to the rangefinder. Close enough for an engagement, but still outside the effective penetration range of standard armor-piercing ammunition against frontal armor. If Hendricks followed doctrine, he would wait until the Panthers crossed the bridge and moved south, then attempt to engage their thinner side or rear armor as they passed. But doctrine hadn't accounted for tungsten. With HVAP, 730 meters was well within effective range, especially if he could aim for specific weak points where armor was thinner or angled more favorably. Morrison made the decision for him. All Baker units, target lead Panther, HVAP rounds, fire on my command. The turret crew moved with the practiced efficiency that came from months of training and weeks of combat. Corporal Davis, the gunner, traversed right, centering the lead Panther in his sight. The tank was still moving, which complicated the solution. But German tankers were cautious in unfamiliar terrain. The Panther was advancing at perhaps 6 miles per hour, slow enough that Davis could track it through the optics and predict its position when the round arrived. Reardon opened the main gun breech and loaded the first HVAP round. The tungsten cord projectile sliding into the chamber with a metallic click that seemed too quiet for what it represented. Hendricks watched through his periscope as the lead Panther approached the bridge. The German tank commander was unbuttoned, standing in the cupola with his head and shoulders exposed, scanning the terrain with binoculars. He was looking in the wrong direction, focused on the southern approach where he expected American forces to appear, not the western ridge where 5 Shermans waited with ammunition he didn't know existed. Morrison's voice, calm and almost conversational. On my count. 3, 2, 1, fire. 5 76mm guns, fired within a half-second of each other. The muzzle blasts erupting in sharp cracks that echoed off the frozen hills. 5 tungsten cord projectiles left their barrels at over 3,400 feet per second, traveling the 730 meters to target in less than 1 second of flight time. 5 rounds that represented a technological revolution in American anti-tank warfare concentrated against a single target. The lead Panther absorbed 3 hits almost simultaneously. Davis's round struck low on the glacis plate, penetrating through armor that should have been invulnerable and detonating somewhere in the driver's compartment. A second round, probably from Morrison's tank, hit the turret ring, shearing through the thinner armor that connected turret to hull. The third hit struck the mantlet dead center, punching through the gun shield and disappearing into the fighting compartment. The effect was catastrophic. Smoke began pouring from every hatch and vision port as internal fires ignited ammunition, fuel, and hydraulic fluid. The Panther lurched to a stop, its engine still running, but its crew already abandoning ship through hatches that opened like escape valves on a pressure cooker. Within seconds, the tank was fully engulfed, flames licking up through the commander's cupola and boiling out through the turret hatches in black columns that marked the position for every German unit within 5 kilometers. The second Panther reacted with the speed that came from veteran crews who had survived 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front. Its turret traversed left, searching for the source of fire, while the driver threw the transmission into reverse and began backing toward the tree line. But 730 meters was too far for immediate counterfire, and the Panther's own commander had made the tactical error of following too close behind the lead tank. As he backed up, his Panther's rear struck the third tank in the column, metal screeching against metal as the 2 vehicles momentarily tangled. Morrison didn't give them time to sort it out. Baker units target second Panther, fire at will. The second volley was less coordinated, but equally effective. 4 rounds fired within 3 seconds, 3 misses that kicked up snow and frozen earth around the target, 1 hit that struck the Panther's side armor as it presented itself during the backing maneuver. HVAP didn't need a perfect angle against side armor. The tungsten penetrator burned through the 50mm plate like a cutting torch through tin, the shaped charge detonating inside the crew compartment and sending fragments ricocheting through the interior at velocities that made survival impossible. The 3rd and 4th Panthers broke formation, one attempting to continue forward across the bridge while the other tried to reverse back toward the tree line. Morrison's tank engaged the one crossing, scoring a hit on the turret that penetrated but failed to completely disable the vehicle. The German crew kept fighting, traversing their own gun toward Morrison's position and firing a round that screamed overhead and detonated against the hillside 30 meters behind the American line. Hendricks made a split-second decision. The 4th Panther, the one attempting to retreat, had its rear armor facing his position. Even without HVAP, he could penetrate. He gave Davis the command. Traverse left, target trailing Panther, standard AP, fire when ready. Davis fired. 3 seconds later, the M62 armor-piercing round struck the Panther's engine deck, penetrating the thinner rear armor and detonating inside the power plant. The tank shuddered to a stop, black smoke pouring from the exhaust as the engine seized. The crew bailed out immediately, running for the tree line in a disciplined withdrawal that suggested these were not the conscripts and replacements who had filled out German units after Normandy. These were veterans, and they would remember this day. The 3rd Panther, damaged but still mobile, completed its crossing of the bridge and disappeared. Into the tree line south of the crossroads, Morrison didn't order pursuit. The tactical situation was too uncertain, and doctrine dictated that Sherman tanks didn't chase Panthers into close terrain where the German crew could set an ambush. 3 out of 4 was a victory beyond anything American tankers had achieved in a single engagement against heavy German armor. The silence that followed the engagement was broken only by the crackle of flames from the burning Panthers and the sound of Morrison's voice calling in a spot report to battalion. 4 Panthers engaged, 3 destroyed, 1 damaged and withdrawn. 5 HVAP rounds expended from our allocation. No friendly casualties. Inside Hendricks's turret, Ardennes was already reloading, replacing the expended standard round with another HVAP from the ammunition rack. They had 3 tungsten rounds left. Somewhere out there, German armor was still moving, still trying to escape the Allied trap that was closing around the Bulge. And whenever they came, Hendricks' crew would be ready, because for the first time since Normandy, American tankers had ammunition that could kill what they were sent to kill. And that changed everything. The burned-out hulks of 3 Panthers marked the crossroads like gravestones. By 10:45, reconnaissance elements from 3rd Battalion had moved forward to examine the wrecks, confirming what Hendricks's crew already knew. All 3 tanks had been penetrated by ammunition that German armor doctrine said shouldn't exist. The holes punched through glacis plates and turret mantlets told a story that would be repeated in after-action reports filed up through division, corps, and Army headquarters. The Americans had finally fielded ammunition capable of defeating German heavy armor at combat ranges. But 3 tanks destroyed in a single engagement, however satisfying, did not constitute the systematic destruction that Morrison's platoon would achieve over the next 48 hours. The German withdrawal from the Ardennes was not a rout, but a fighting retreat, conducted by formations that retained their cohesion and combat effectiveness despite catastrophic losses. The Panthers that escaped the crossroads ambush reported the engagement to their parent unit, the 9th Panzer Division, which immediately adjusted its withdrawal routes to avoid the obvious choke points where American forces had established ambush positions. What followed was a game of tactical chess played across frozen fields and snow-choked forests, with Morrison's platoon serving as the mobile blocking force that interdicted German movement whenever and wherever opportunity presented itself. The 5 Shermans moved south from the crossroads at 1100 hours, relocating to a new position near the village of Majoret, where intelligence reported German armor was concentrating for a counterattack against American forces pushing east from Bastogne. The new position offered better concealment, but worse fields of fire, a tree-covered hillside that overlooked a road junction but limited engagement ranges to 400 meters or less. The short range was actually an advantage when fighting with HVAP ammunition. At 400 meters, the M93 round could penetrate the Panthers frontal glacis with near certainty, eliminating the need for flanking maneuvers that exposed American tanks to return fire. The tactical problem shifted from how to achieve penetration to how to achieve surprise, because German tank commanders who knew they were being engaged at close range could return fire with devastating effect before the Sherman crews could reload and fire again. Morrison addressed this problem with a tactical innovation that would be studied in armored warfare schools for decades afterward. Instead of positioning all 5 tanks in a single firing line, he echeloned them in depth, with 2 tanks forward in concealed positions and 3 tanks back, ready to move forward and engage if the forward tanks made contact. The forward tanks would achieve surprise and fire. The first volley. If they destroyed all targets, the engagement ended. If German tanks survived and returned fire, the forward tanks would displace rearward while the reserve tanks moved up and engaged from new positions. The Germans would be fighting an enemy that appeared, fired, and vanished before they could mass their superior firepower. The system worked exactly as designed when German armor appeared at the Margaret Junction at 1320 hours on January 8th. 4 Panthers from the 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion approached the junction from the north, moving with the caution of crews who had already heard reports about the crossroads ambush. Their turrets traversed constantly, commanders scanning terrain with binoculars, searching for the telltale signatures that indicated American armor was present. They never saw the 2 Shermans positioned 350 meters west of the road, hull down behind a stone barn, with their gun barrels barely visible through gaps in the damaged walls. Hendricks, occupying one of the forward positions, tracked the lead Panther through his sights as it approached the junction at walking speed. At 350 meters, even the Panther's frontal glacis was vulnerable to HVAP. Davis centered his aiming point on the lower glacis where armor was thinnest and the angle of slope was most favorable for penetration. Morrison's command came through the headset. Forward elements, HVAP rounds, fire on my mark. The 2 forward Shermans fired together. Both rounds struck their targets within the same half-second. 2 Panthers disabled before their crews understood they were under attack. Hendricks' round penetrated the lead Panther through the lower glacis, the tungsten penetrator burning through 80 millimeters of sloped armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The tank lurched forward as the driver's compartment flooded with flame, then ground to a halt as ammunition cooked off in secondary explosions that blew the turret hatches open. The 2nd Panther, struck by Morrison's gunner, absorbed the hit on the turret face just left of the main gun. The round penetrated completely, entering the fighting compartment and killing or wounding the entire turret crew. The tank continued moving forward for several seconds, its engines still running and its transmission still engaged, until it rolled off the road and came to rest against a low stone wall. The 3rd and 4th Panthers reacted immediately, their turrets traversing toward the barn where muzzle flashes had revealed the American position. But Morrison had already given the displacement order, and Hendricks's driver was backing the Sherman away from the firing position before the German guns could bear. The Panthers fired anyway, 2 rounds that struck the barn and sent stone fragments flying, but did no damage to tanks that were already gone. That was when the reserve element engaged. 3 Shermans positioned 400 meters south of the junction opened fire on the Panthers' exposed flanks. At this range and angle, even standard armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate, but Morrison had ordered his reserve tanks to load HVAP anyway, because certainty of kill was worth the expenditure of scarce ammunition. 3 tungsten cord rounds struck home within 2 seconds, punching through side armor that was only 40 millimeters thick and detonating inside crew compartments that offered no protection against the hyper-velocity projectiles. Both Panthers died where they stood. The 3rd tank in the column exploded spectacularly as its ammunition load detonated all at once, the turret lifting several feet into the air before crashing back down onto the hull. The 4th Panther simply burned. Thick, black smoke pouring from every hatch as the crew attempted to bail out. Only the driver escaped, stumbling away from the inferno with his uniform on fire and his face blackened by smoke and flash burns. 4 Panthers destroyed in less than 30 seconds, 7 dead or destroyed in total since the engagement at the crossroads 5 hours earlier. The kill ratio that doctrine said required 5 Shermans for every Panther had been inverted. Morrison's platoon had engaged 11 German tanks over the course of January 8th and destroyed 7 of them without suffering a single loss. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the cost of that success was becoming clear as Reardon counted the remaining HVAP rounds in their ammunition rack, 3 gone from Hendricks' tank, with only 2 remaining. Morrison's tank had expended 4 rounds and retained just 1. Across the platoon, the count was similar. 16 HVAP rounds had been distributed to 5 tanks, 9 had been fired, 7 remained, and there was no prospect of resupply because the division's entire allocation had already been distributed. Morrison made the decision that every tank commander dreaded. From this point forward, HVAP rounds would be fired only against targets that could not be engaged effectively with standard ammunition. Panthers presenting frontal armor at medium range qualified. Panthers engaged from the flank or rear did not. Panzer IVs, even from the front, did not. The arithmetic was cold and unforgiving, but it reflected a reality that American tankers understood better than anyone. Tungsten was more valuable than gold, and every round had to count. The engagement tempo slowed after Margaret as German forces adjusted their withdrawal routes to avoid roads where American armor was known to be positioned. Morrison's platoon spent the remainder of January 8th in defensive positions overlooking the Bastogne perimeter, watching as Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division consolidated the corridor that Lieutenant Boges's tanks had opened on December the 26th. The relief of Bastogne had been the psychological turning point of the Bulge, but the tactical situation remained fluid. German forces still controlled most of the ground they had captured during the initial assault, and Hitler's orders prohibited any withdrawal that wasn't forced by overwhelming enemy pressure. That pressure came on January 9th, when First Army launched a general offensive from the north, while Patton's Third Army pushed from the south, attempting to cut off and destroy the German salient before the Panzer divisions could escape across the Aar River into Germany. The plan was sound in theory, but complicated by terrain and weather. The Ardennes in January was a nightmare of frozen roads, snow-covered forests, and limited visibility that reduced engagement ranges and made coordinated movement nearly impossible. American forces advanced by kilometers rather than miles, fighting for every village and crossroads against German rearguards that used terrain and weather to maximum advantage. Morrison's platoon moved north from Bastogne on the morning of January 9th, attached to Combat Command A's thrust toward Houffalize. The objective was to link up with First Army elements pushing south, closing the pocket and trapping whatever German forces remained inside. Intelligence estimated that 3 Panzer divisions were still operational within the salient, along with supporting infantry and artillery formations that retained enough combat power to make the American advance costly. The estimate proved conservative. By noon on January 9th, Morrison's platoon had made contact with German armor 3 separate times, brief engagements at ranges between 200 and 500 meters where visibility was limited by terrain and falling snow. The first engagement destroyed a single Panzer IV that attempted to block the road south of Neville. Standard armor-piercing ammunition was sufficient at close range, and the German crew abandoned their tank after the first penetrating hit set the engine compartment on fire. The second engagement was more complex. 2 Panthers and 3 Panzer IVs occupied a tree line east of the village of Borsy, positioned to provide covering fire for German infantry that was withdrawing through the village. Morrison's platoon engaged from hull-down positions 600 meters west, using a combination of HVAP and standard ammunition, depending on target type and angle. 1 Panther was destroyed with tungsten, struck on the turret mantlet by Hendricks' gunner after a ranging shot with standard ammunition established the proper ballistics. The 2nd Panther withdrew after taking 2 hits that failed to penetrate its glacis, but convinced the crew that discretion was the better part of valor. The 3 Panzer IVs were engaged with standard ammunition, 2 destroyed and 1 damaged. The third engagement nearly ended in disaster. A lone Panther, its crew either brave or foolish beyond measure, occupied a position in the ruins of a stone church on the outskirts of Borsy. The tank was perfectly positioned to ambush American forces advancing through the village, its gun covering the only road wide enough for Sherman tanks to use. Morrison's lead tank, commanded by Sergeant William Torres, rounded the corner at 15 meters per hour and took a 75mm round through the turret at point-blank range. The German crew had loaded high explosive rather than armor-piercing, probably because they expected to engage infantry rather than armor. The mistake saved Torres and his crew. The HE round detonated on the turret face rather than penetrating, sending fragments through the commander's hatch but failing to disable the tank. Torres's gunner returned fire with the coaxial machine gun while his driver threw the Sherman into reverse, backing around the corner before the Panther could reload and fire again. Hendricks, positioned third in the column, heard the engagement over the radio and made an immediate decision. Rather than back up and try to flank the Panther through the village, he ordered Martinez to drive forward using Torres's damaged tank as cover. It was a calculated risk based on simple geometry. The Panther's gun could not depress enough to hit a target directly in front of its position, if that target was close enough. At ranges under 20 meters, the Sherman would be in a dead zone where the German crew couldn't bring their main gun to bear. Martinez accelerated forward, the Sherman's Ford GAA engine roaring as the tank picked up speed. They cleared Torres's position at 25 meters per hour, too fast for the Panther crew to traverse and engage, even if they had wanted to. Hendricks could see the German tank now, just its turret visible above the rubble of the church. The barrel was traversing left, tracking the Sherman's movement, but the angle was wrong and getting worse as Martinez closed the range. At 15 meters, Hendricks gave the fire command. Davis didn't need to aim. At this range, he could hardly miss. The 76mm gun fired, the standard armor-piercing round, striking the Panther's turret at nearly point-blank range. The penetration was complete, the projectile entering the fighting compartment and detonating against the turret basket. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition ignited, and within seconds the Panther was burning from the inside out. 3 more German tanks destroyed, 10 in total, over 36 hours. But the cost was mounting in ways that went beyond ammunition expenditure. Torres's tank was combat ineffective, its turret traverse damaged, and its commander wounded by fragments. The crew was evacuated to the rear, reducing Morrison's platoon to 4 effective tanks. Maintenance issues were accumulating across all vehicles. Hendricks's Sherman had developed a problem with the gun stabilizer, making it difficult to fire accurately while moving. Morrison's tank was leaking hydraulic fluid from the turret traverse system, requiring manual traverse that slowed engagement times. The other 2 tanks reported similar issues, the inevitable consequence of sustained combat operations in sub-freezing temperatures. But the German situation was worse, and every American tanker knew it. The Panthers and Tigers that had seemed invincible in Normandy were revealing themselves to be mechanically fragile machines that required constant maintenance and consumed fuel at rates the German logistics system could no longer support. Panther final drives failed with such regularity that German commanders expected to lose 1/3 of their operational tanks to mechanical breakdown during any sustained movement. Tiger tanks were even worse, their overlapping road wheel systems freezing solid in cold weather and their transmissions shattering under the stress of their own weight. The Americans had numbers and logistics. A Sherman that broke down could be recovered, repaired, and returned to service within days. A Panther that threw a track or broke a final drive was often abandoned by its crew because German recovery vehicles couldn't reach the disabled tank before American forces overran the position. The material advantage that American industrial production provided was finally translating into tactical advantage on the battlefield. And now, with HVAP ammunition, American crews had firepower that approached parity with German heavy armor. It wasn't perfect. The tungsten rounds were still too scarce, and the Sherman's armor still couldn't protect against the German guns. But for the first time since the campaign in Northwest Europe had begun, American tankers could engage Panthers frontally with a reasonable expectation of success. The psychological impact of that shift was profound. Hendricks noticed it in his own crew's behavior. Reardon no longer flinched when the radio reported Panthers in the area. Davis approached each engagement with confidence rather than resignation. Martinez drove more aggressively, closing ranges that would have been suicidal 3 months earlier. The fear was still there, but it was manageable now, controlled by the knowledge that they had ammunition that could kill what they were fighting. The German crews noticed it too. Prisoners captured after the Borsy engagement reported that American tanks were behaving differently, engaging at longer ranges and hitting with higher accuracy than German commanders had come to expect. The reports were dismissed by some senior officers as defeatism or exaggeration, but experienced tank commanders understood what was happening. The Americans had solved their firepower problem, and the tactical balance that had favored German armor since Normandy was shifting. By the evening of January 9th, Morrison's platoon had established defensive positions on high ground northeast of Borsy, overlooking the routes German forces would have to use if they attempted to break out of the shrinking salient. The snow had stopped falling and the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that Hendricks ordered the crew to run the engine continuously despite fuel consumption concerns. Hypothermia killed just as effectively as German guns, and a crew that was too cold to function was useless regardless of how good their ammunition was. The division's intelligence summary, distributed at 1800 hours, painted a picture of German forces in disarray. The 9th Panzer Division had been reduced to approximately 30 operational tanks, down from over 100 at the start of the offensive. The 2nd Panzer Division was in similar condition. The elite 1st SS Panzer Division, which had spearheaded the northern thrust toward Antwerp, had been fought to a standstill at Krinkelt-Rocherath and was now withdrawing with less than 40% of its original tank strength. But the summary also included a warning. German forces were not surrendering. They were trading space for time, conducting a fighting withdrawal that preserved unit cohesion and prepared defensive positions east of the Aar River where the terrain favored the defender. The war was not over. It might not even be close to over, but the momentum had shifted, and every American soldier, from private to general, understood what that meant. On the morning of January 10th, Morrison's platoon received orders to advance east toward Houffalize, where 1st and 3rd Armies were expected to link up within 24 hours. The advance would take them through the heart of what had been the German salient, across ground that 3 weeks earlier had been held by enemy forces, confident they were winning the war. Now that ground was littered with the wreckage of German ambitions, burned-out tanks and abandoned vehicles marking the high-water mark of Hitler's final gamble in the West. Hendricks's crew moved out at 0700, the Sherman's engine running smoothly despite the cold. They had one HVAP round remaining in their ammunition rack. Morrison's tank had none. Across the platoon, the count was 3 tungsten rounds total. Not enough for a sustained engagement, but enough for one more fight if the Germans were foolish enough to offer battle. They made contact at 0915, 3 kilometers south of Houffalize. A single Panther, its crew apparently separated from their parent unit, occupied a position overlooking the road. The German tanks was oriented south, its commander probably expecting American forces to approach from that direction rather than from the northwest, where Morrison's platoon was advancing. Morrison didn't hesitate. All Baker units, target that Panther, fire on my command. 4 Sherman tanks fired almost simultaneously, 3 standard armor-piercing rounds, and 1 HVAP, the last tungsten round in Morrison's platoon inventory. All 4 rounds struck within 2 seconds. The impacts clustered on the Panther's turret and upper hull. 1 standard round bounced off the glacis, ricocheting into the sky with a sound like a bell being struck. The other 2 standard rounds achieved partial penetration, cracking armor plates but failing to completely defeat the protection. The HVAP round, fired by Corporal Samuel Jennings from the 4th tank in Morrison's platoon, struck the turret mantle at dead center. The tungsten penetrator burned through 100 millimeters of armor and detonated inside the fighting compartment, killing the crew instantly and setting off a sympathetic detonation of the tank's ammunition load. The Panther exploded with such violence that the turret separated completely from the hull, cartwheeling 20 meters before crashing to earth in a shower of dirt and snow. 11 German tanks destroyed over 48 hours. The last one killed with the last HVAP round Morrison's platoon possessed. The mathematics were perfect in their symmetry, though Hendricks knew the symmetry was mostly coincidence. They could have destroyed 12 or 13 if they had engaged differently, prioritized targets differently, fired more carefully or more rapidly, depending on the tactical situation. But 11 was the number that would appear in the after-action reports, and 11 was enough to make Morrison's platoon one of the most successful Sherman units in the European theater during the Battle of the Bulge. First and Third Armies linked up at Houffalize on January 16, 1945, exactly 1 month after the German offensive had begun. The meeting was anticlimactic, just 2 forward patrols, shaking hands in the ruins of a town that had been fought over for 4 weeks. But the symbolism was clear. The salient had been eliminated. German forces that remained west of the Aue River were trapped, and those that had escaped were broken formations that would require months to rebuild. Morrison's platoon was pulled off the line on January 18th and sent to the rear for maintenance and refitting. The 4 remaining Shermans had accumulated battle damage that made them unsafe for continued operations. Hendricks's tank needed a new transmission, gun stabilizer, and suspension components. Morrison's tank required a complete turret overhaul. The other 2 tanks had similar issues, the inevitable result of pushing machinery beyond its design limits in conditions that manufacturers had never anticipated. The crews were in better condition than their tanks, though exhaustion and stress had taken their toll. Ardennes had lost 15 pounds over the previous month, surviving on emergency rations and adrenaline. Davis had developed a tremor in his hands that made fine motor control difficult. Martinez slept 18 hours straight after they reached the rear area, waking only when physically shaken by Hendricks. But they had survived. More importantly, they had proven that Sherman tanks equipped with 76mm guns and HVAP ammunition could compete against German heavy armor on terms approaching parity. The lesson would be applied throughout the remaining months of the war as American industrial production finally caught up with tactical requirements, and HVAP rounds began arriving in Europe in quantities sufficient to make a difference. By March of 1945, American tank battalions were requesting that all replacement tanks be 76mm gun variants, refusing to accept any more of the 75mm models that had been standard equipment just 6 months earlier. The tide had turned, not because of any single technological breakthrough, but because of the gradual accumulation of small advantages that American production capacity could provide and German industry could not match. The Sherman tank would never be the equal of the Panther or Tiger in a direct comparison of armor thickness and gun performance. But wars are not won by direct comparisons. They are won by logistics, production capacity, crew training, and the ability to maintain equipment in the field under adverse conditions. In all those categories, the Americans had decisive advantages that German tactical excellence could not overcome. And sometimes, just sometimes, American tanks also had tungsten. The official after-action report filed by Captain James Morrison on January 21st, 1945, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. 11 enemy tanks destroyed, it notes, with casualties limited to 1 friendly tank damaged and 2 crew members wounded. The report recommends commendation for Sergeant Michael Hendricks for actions at the Bulge engagement and requests immediate resupply of M93 HVAP ammunition for all 76mm gun tanks in the battalion. It does not explore the deeper implications of what Morrison's platoon had accomplished. It does not analyze the psychological transformation that occurred when American tank crews finally possessed ammunition that could defeat German heavy armor frontally. It does not ask the question that would haunt historians for decades afterward: why did it take so long? The technical answer is straightforward. Tungsten was a strategic material in short supply, and the industrial processes required to manufacture HVAP ammunition were complex and time-consuming. The M93 round used a tungsten carbide penetrator core surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and ballistic windshield, with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Any deviation from specifications would cause the projectile to tumble in flight or fail to penetrate properly upon impact. American industry in 1944 was performing miracles of production, but even miracles had limits. The bureaucratic answer is more complicated. The HVAP round was developed in 1943 tested successfully against captured German armor in early 1944 and approved for production in August of that year. But approval did not mean immediate availability. Production had to be ramped up, distribution priorities established, logistics pipelines filled, tank destroyer battalions received first priority because their sole mission was destroying enemy armor. Separate tank battalions attached to infantry divisions received second priority because they were most likely to encounter German tanks in defensive positions. Armored division tank battalions, the units that would actually conduct the sustained tank versus tank combat that characterized the fighting in Northwest Europe, were last on the list. The doctrinal answer reveals assumptions about warfare that had been obsolete since Normandy, but remained embedded in American tactical thinking through the Battle of the Bulge. American armor doctrine in 1944 envisioned tank battalions as exploitation forces that would break through enemy lines and rampage through rear areas, destroying logistics and command structures while avoiding direct combat with enemy armor whenever possible. Enemy tanks were supposed to be handled by tank destroyers, specialized units equipped with high-velocity guns mounted on lightly armored chassis that could move quickly to threaten sectors and destroy German armor through superior firepower and tactical mobility. The problem was, the German armor refused to cooperate with American doctrine. Panthers and Tigers did not present themselves as targets for tank destroyers operating in open terrain. They fought from prepared positions in close country where tank destroyers could not maneuver effectively. They integrated themselves with infantry and anti-tank guns in defensive positions that required tanks, not tank destroyers, to break through, and they engaged American Sherman battalions in sustained combat that doctrine said should never happen. By the time American commanders fully understood how badly their doctrine had failed to predict battlefield reality, tens of thousands of tank crewmen had paid the price in blood and burned-out Shermans. Hendricks and his fellow tankers were the survivors, the lucky ones who had lived long enough to see tungsten ammunition arrive in quantities sufficient to make a tactical difference. But they carried with them the memories of comrades who had died in July, August, September of 1944, killed by German guns that their own ammunition could not defeat. The psychological cost of that knowledge was impossible to quantify. Hendricks never spoke publicly about his experiences during the Battle of the Bulge, though he agreed to a brief interview for a local newspaper in Iowa in 1952. The interviewer asked him what it felt like to finally have ammunition that could kill German heavy tanks. Hendricks thought for a long moment before answering. "It felt like someone had finally given us a fair chance," he said. "Like we were fighting a war instead of committing suicide." The interviewer pressed him on the point. Had he felt like he was committing suicide before HVAP ammunition arrived? Hendricks' response was more revealing than any after-action report. "We were told the Sherman was a good tank," he said. "We were told our tactics were sound. We were told that if we fought smart and used combined arms, we could beat anything the Germans had. And all of that was true, mostly. But when you're sitting in a tank that you know can't penetrate the enemy's armor frontally and the enemy can penetrate yours at any range they can hit you, the mathematics are pretty simple. You can be brave, you can be smart, you can be lucky, but eventually the odds catch up with you. HVAP didn't make the odds good, it just made them survivable. The broader strategic impact of HVAP ammunition is difficult to isolate from other factors that contributed to Allied victory in Northwest Europe. By January of 1945, German forces were collapsing on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front had consumed entire army groups. Allied air power had destroyed German logistics and industrial capacity. Fuel shortages had immobilized Panzer divisions that were technically operational, but could not move. The 76mm HVAP round was one piece of a larger puzzle, important but not decisive in isolation. But for the men who crewed Sherman tanks in the winter of 1944 and 1945, HVAP represented something more profound than a tactical improvement. It represented vindication, proof that their complaints about firepower had been legitimate, proof that the casualties they had suffered were not inevitable consequences of war, but failures of planning and priorities. Proof that when American industry and American will were properly directed, they could produce weapons that matched or exceeded anything the enemy could field. Morrison's platoon was not unique. Across the 2nd Armored Division and throughout 1st and 3rd Armies, Sherman crews equipped with HVAP ammunition achieved kill ratios against German armor that would have been impossible 3 months earlier. The collective impact of those individual successes was measurable in ways that after-action reports captured only imperfectly. German tank commanders who had grown accustomed to engaging American Shermans with confidence now approached each engagement with caution and uncertainty. Panzer crews who had considered themselves tactically superior began experiencing the same psychological pressure that American crews had endured since Normandy. The tables had not turned completely. German tanks remained superior in armor protection and gun performance. But the gap had narrowed enough that crew training, tactical position, and first-shot accuracy often determined the outcome of engagements rather than technical specifications alone. And in all those categories, American advantages in training time, logistical support, and doctrinal flexibility provided edges that German tactical excellence could no longer overcome. Hendricks returned to Iowa in October of 1945. Discharged from the Army with the rank of Staff Sergeant and decorations that included the Silver Star for his actions at Borsee. He married his high school sweetheart in December, found work at a John Deere factory in Waterloo, and settled into a life that bore no resemblance to the months he had spent in frozen forests fighting battles that newspapers described with words like heroic and decisive. He never considered himself a hero. He had done a job that needed doing, with equipment that was finally adequate for the task, and he had been fortunate enough to survive. That was all. But in the quiet moments, when nightmares woke him at 2 in the morning and he found himself unable to return to sleep, Hendricks thought about the 11 German tanks his crew had helped destroy over 48 hours in January of 1945. He thought about the Panthers burning at the crossroads, the Panzer IVs smoldering at Magaret, the final Panther south of Houffalize exploding with such violence that the turret had separated from the hull. He thought about Torres's crew, wounded but alive because a German gunner had loaded the wrong ammunition. He thought about crews that had not been so lucky, men he had known who had died in tanks that burned because their armor couldn't protect them and their ammunition couldn't save them. And he thought about tungsten, about 5 rounds, distributed to each tank in a gesture so inadequate that it seemed almost insulting, except that those 5 rounds had made the difference between fighting and dying, about an ammunition shortage that had been solved too late to save thousands of tank crewmen, but early enough to matter for those who came after, about a weapon that had finally, belatedly, given American tankers the tools they needed to fight the war they had been asked to fight. The M93 HVAP round remained in American service through the Korean War, where Sherman tanks armed with 76mm guns and supplied with adequate quantities of tungsten ammunition destroyed 41 enemy tanks between July and November of 1950, primarily North Korean T-34-85s. The lesson of the European theater had been learned. When American tankers had ammunition that matched their tactical requirements, they could fight and win against any opponent. But that lesson had come at terrible cost. The exact number of American tank crewmen killed or wounded in Northwest Europe between June and December of 1944 will never be known with certainty. Personnel records from the period are incomplete, and many casualties were recorded as infantry losses rather than armor losses due to the bureaucratic complexities of how separate tank battalions were organized and administered. Conservative estimates place the figure at over 15,000 casualties, the majority occurring in Sherman tanks, equipped with ammunition that could not defeat the armor they were sent to fight. Morrison himself survived the war and remained in the Army, retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1963 after serving in Korea and various staff positions in Europe and the United States. In a speech given to armor officers at Fort Knox in 1961, he addressed the HVAP issue directly, speaking with a candor that would have been impossible during the war itself. We knew the ammunition was inadequate, he said. The men knew it, the platoon leaders knew it, company commanders, battalion commanders, everyone up through division knew it. What we didn't know was whether anyone at higher headquarters cared or whether they were going to do anything about it. When HVAP finally arrived in January of 45, it felt like vindication. It felt like someone had finally listened, but it also felt like it was too late for too many good men who had died asking for exactly what we finally received. The audience of young armor officers listened in silence. These were men who had trained on M48 Patton tanks, equipped with 90mm guns, capable of defeating any known armor at combat ranges. They had grown up in an army that took firepower superiority for granted, that assumed American technology would always provide an edge over potential adversaries. Morrison's speech was a reminder that superiority was not automatic, that the lessons of the past had been purchased with blood, and that complacency could cost lives in future conflicts. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.